Thank you, Andy. It's always a joy for me to be at Phillips Street, and you're so encouraging here, and I appreciate that very much, and been looking forward to this opportunity for quite some time. Especially excited tonight to be able to preach the gospel on my birthday. Today is my birthday. I can't think of any place I'd rather be or anything I'd rather be doing than right here with you preaching the gospel tonight. I hope you've got your taxes in. You know this is also tax day as well. My family used to refer to me as their little tax deduction since I was born on April 15th. But nonetheless, I understand I share a birthday with Kennedy. Is that right? I'm glad I got that right. So I'm excited to know that as well. But I'm most excited about our subject tonight. Nehemiah is one of my heroes, and I love to preach about anything that has to do with Nehemiah. And to talk about his leadership skills and qualities, that's the very top of the things that I admire and respect about him. So I'm very excited about this tonight. And, I think this book is the perfect book for you to be studying in this lectureship. I think in many ways the church is facing very similar circumstances today to that which Nehemiah and his people were facing. Nehemiah lived in a time that was long after the golden age of Israel under Solomon's reign, that time when they were really at the pinnacle as far as their wealth and their power and all of that was concerned. Now, all of that was long forgotten by the time that Nehemiah came onto the scene. They'd already suffered the division of the kingdom into those 10 northern tribes and 2 southern tribes. The 10 northern tribes are defeated by Assyria. Then the southern tribes are defeated by Babylon. And the very finest among the Israelites were taken far away from their homeland to become servants in Babylon. Men like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had to serve God in a foreign land. And finally, after 70 years of that captivity, a benevolent king took over when Persia defeated Babylon and Cyrus came into power. And Cyrus was a generous man. He allowed the Jews to go back home. He even gave them the resources that they need to be able to rebuild their temple. Now there was opposition there, so it took them about 20 years to finish the temple. And when they finished it, there was this interesting situation where the younger men rejoiced. They were back in the homeland, the promised land now. And the temple was standing again. It hadn't been standing at all for 70 years, or more than that, actually. The captivity lasted 70 years. So there was a temple standing. But the older men, remembering Solomon's temple from when they were young children, saw how inferior the new temple was in glory to the temple that Solomon built, so they wept. And the commotion was so drastic that the Bible says you couldn't discern which was which. Was it rejoicing or weeping? They were both going on so strongly. This was a country that was once one nation under God, a nation founded on Christian principles, a climate in which the church at one time had a remarkable opportunity to grow. Some people in this assembly tonight remember that, especially that period in the 40s and 50s when the church was growing so rapidly and was at one time among and possibly at the top of the list of the fastest growing religious groups in the country, maybe even in the world. And yet we know, let's just be frankly honest, we're past that time now. I have an opportunity to speak at a number of congregations in our area, visit with them and listen to them about what they're going through. Many of our congregations now are half of what they once were or less. And this is very distressing and very discouraging for all of us. We're eager, we're urgent, we want to know what do we do next. And in many ways, we are in a much similar position to these people at this particular time. Their glory days seem to be behind them, And now they're in a position to ask themselves, what do we do? Are we just supposed to accept this situation the way it is now? That it's never going to be as good as it once was? We might as well just get used to it. Or should we try to push forward? Should we try to continue doing what we're doing? Should we continue to make that effort to be the workers that God would have us to be? And I think for a window of time, there was a group of people who were okay with just accepting it. Let's just keep house for a little while, and we'll just have to learn to live with it. And the reason I say that is that for almost 100 years after they returned back to their homeland, they didn't rebuild the walls of the city. Now, God was their defense. They didn't really need walls to protect them, but as long as the walls were continuing to remain in rubbish, it was like a symbol. You know, it's like a lot of our downtowns now and many of our small towns around this area. And so many of the buildings there are an empty shell. And it's not just that those buildings are taking up space, but for me, I don't know, maybe I'm the only one that feels this way. It feels like some of the life has left that community. It's sad. And I think those walls still lying in ruins around the city of Jerusalem was something like that. It was almost as though the life was gone out of that city. And Nehemiah was a man who rose up at that time and refused to be satisfied with the status quo. I can see it in your eyes tonight that you have the same spirit that he did. You are not ready to accept that the way it is now is the way it's always going to be in this country. That the state of the church now is going to be the state of the church from here on out. We're not willing to accept that. We're having this lectureship. We are here tonight because there is the potential among us for leaders like Nehemiah to rise up and say, let's get back to work. Let's be faithful to the Lord. Let's build up His house. This is the perfect place for us to be studying right now. Tonight, we're going to study about his leadership qualities. We're going to study about some of the other areas of this work. I wish I could preach every one of these sermons because every one of these chapters is a favorite for me. But tonight, we're going to talk about his leadership qualities. And really and truly, I could have gone a number of different places in this book, but looking at the schedule, I could see some of the other things that are going to be addressed. So tonight, here's what we're going to do. We're going to focus primarily on chapter 1. If you want to be opening your Bibles there, you can go ahead and be doing that. And here's the reason I want to just really focus on chapter 1. God saw the situation. He saw the problem that needed to be addressed. And among everything that was available at that time, he looked down at Nehemiah and he said, that's the man. He's the man for the job. He's the one that I need to go address this problem. He will be the leader that my people need in order to rebuild those walls around the city again. And I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, Lord, if you need a man today, I want to be that man, one among many. I want to be that man that you can count on in this generation. He will not give up. He will not give in. He will not resign to the times. He will give everything he has to make it good again and flourish again. I want to be that man. So I look at chapter 1 and I'm looking for the things there that Nehemiah possessed that caused God to point his finger at him and say, you are the man. I want to emulate those characteristics today. And because of that, this study is going to focus primarily on the character of this man. Norman Schwarzkopf once said that leadership is a potent combination of character and strategy. And he said, if you must be without one, be without strategy. Character. If you want to lead people, you have to lead by example. There's no other way. You cannot fake it. You cannot lead people to do things that you're not doing yourself. So the way to lead is to first begin by looking internally and striving for the things in yourself that you see need to be outwardly. And I want to make one thing clear. Tonight we talk about leaders. We're talking about preachers? Yes. We're talking about elders? Yes, we're talking about elders. We're talking about deacons. We're talking about teachers and in our Bible classes and things of that nature. But we're not limiting it to that by any stretch of the imagination. We are all leaders in one sense or another. If you influence someone, you are a leader to that person. We all have a leadership potential within our homes, within our communities, within our places of business or work, our neighborhoods, in this congregation or wherever. We all, if we have a potential for influence, we have a potential for leadership. And thus, we all have a potential to follow in the example of this great man, Nehemiah. So, as we look at chapter 1, here are the things that I want to emphasize about him. I want to emphasize how Nehemiah cared. He really cared about the situation. Then I want to emphasize what he did next. He prayed. The Bible says, cast all of your cares upon him, he careth for you. So Nehemiah began to pray about his cares. But it didn't stop there. After Nehemiah prayed, then he volunteered. He volunteered to be the one who would stop complaining about the problem and start doing something about it. And we want to emphasize all of those things about him tonight because that's what leaders do. They care about the problem. They pray about the problem. And then they find a way to do all that they can do to help solve the problem. And I wish I could tell you it's more complex than that. It's really not. So let's start out by talking about how Nehemiah cared. He cared about the problem. In chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, the Bible says, the words of Nehemiah the son of Hakaliah, and it came to pass in the month of Kislev in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan the citadel. That was where the king's palace was in Persia, more than likely his winter palace. So he's far away from home. Nehemiah is still in Persia at the time that this all begins. Verse 2, Hananiah, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity concerning Jerusalem. So as Nehemiah is back in Persia, some people come from Jerusalem, particularly one of his brothers. He wants to find out how things are going there, get a report about the situation. Verse 3, and they said to me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. So it was, when I heard these words, that I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Those verses show me how deeply Nehemiah cared about what was happening in the city of Jerusalem, God's city. Now, Nehemiah had grown up in a foreign land. He had been born practically in captivity. So all he had ever known was this Persian Empire, Babylonian Empire, those kind of things. But even though he had grown up far away from the promised land, there is no doubt in my mind that his heart belonged to God. His heart belonged to God's city, Jerusalem. And his heart belonged to God's people, the nation of Israel. Nehemiah had a special position in the Persian Empire. He was the king's cupbearer. He was his butler. It goes really beyond being just a butler. He was also in charge of protecting the king, making sure he was not assassinated or poisoned. But he also became a trusted advisor and counselor to the king. This was a very high position in the king's cabinet, if you will. The very fact that a foreign man like Nehemiah would be so trusted by a Persian king, Artaxerxes Longimanus, to be given such a lofty position says something to me about the character of this man. But I want to tell you this. He might have been the king's cupbearer, but first and foremost, Nehemiah was a servant of Jehovah God. Jehovah was on the throne of his heart, and that was what mattered most. That was his first priority. Now, his position as the cupbearer gave him access to the king of Persia, but his faith gave him access to the King, the God of heaven. And he was in the perfect position to be the man that Israel needed to get this work done. God had providentially put him in just the perfect position to go to the king and request what they needed. It amazes me how God finds a way to put the man that he wants or the person that he wants in the place that he wants them to be in his providence. You see him do that with Daniel in both the Babylonian and the Persian Empire. You see him do that with Joseph, making sure that the right man was in the right place to spare his people from famine. You see how he was able to do that with Esther, also under the Persian Empire, King Xerxes, and how she was able to be there in order to prevent this plan from Haman to massacre the Jewish people. God puts the person that he wants in the place that he wants because that's according to his will. I believe that providentially, Andy Brewer stands in this pulpit from week to week because he's the man for the job. He's the man that this congregation needs to help lead in that way. Where there are elders in the church and where there are deacons serving in the church, they are the right man for the right position. But it goes beyond that. When you think about your family, I think about this often. I might be sitting in the living room looking at a picture of myself, my wife, and my 3 children. I look at those 3 children and I sometimes wonder, God, I can't imagine what I have ever done that caused you to trust me with those 3 precious souls. I couldn't have done anything that would have earned that right. But you know what? I got to stop thinking that. You know why? If I wasn't the man for the job, God wouldn't have granted them to me. Same is true for you and your family. It's true for your place of work. At that place, you are the person that is there to be the influence that he needs you to be. We are all perfectly placed in a position that we can use our time, our talents, our abilities, our whatever for his glory, to influence others for his will. The question is, will we be good stewards of that opportunity? People like Daniel, Esther, Joseph, these were people who took that opportunity, made the most of it. Nehemiah took his opportunity, used everything he had to make the most of it. Are we doing the same? Are we doing everything we can to be the godly parent, spouse, preacher, elder, deacon, teacher, member, neighbor, friend, family member that we can be for the glory of God? That's a question worth thinking about. Nehemiah was what he needed to be in that place and in that time, mainly because he cared about it. He cared about it. He cared about God. He cared about God's city. He cared about God's law. You can see just how deeply he cared by the way he reacted to this bad news that came from Jerusalem. The text said he sat down. Literally, he was motionless. You ever heard something was so shocking it just stopped you right in your tracks? It's what this is the way Nehemiah reacted to this. It just stopped him to hear God's city in such a depressing condition. He wept, cried uncontrollably. His heart ached, was breaking in anguish just for thinking about what his people were suffering. Now keep in mind, all the while this is happening, he's sitting up in a comfortable palace in Shushan. He has no reason to worry about their problems. They're not his problems from a purely physical standpoint. He's got a good job, got a good living, got a good place to live. Everything's on the up and up for him. But his heart did not belong to Persia. His heart did not belong to this world. No, Nehemiah cared first and foremost for the things of God. And that's why when he heard about God's people in this distressful situation, his heart was breaking for them. He fasted during that time. Physical things had no appeal to him, and he prayed. He was casting his concern upon God, knowing that that was the place where he needed to turn. He wept for them because he pondered their circumstances and could see the world through their eyes. Several years ago, I heard this sermon via a recording. Andrew Connolly preached a sermon entitled Overcoming the Sin of Mediocrity. His 3 points, which I will never forget in that sermon, were, if we're going to overcome mediocrity, we have to have the dare to dream, the courage to care, and the willingness to work. The dare to dream. It's so easy just to accept the way things are, to learn to live with them, to get adjusted to them. But God deserves more than that when things are not as they ought to be. And then the courage to care. Because if you care, then you become burdened with the problem. It's your problem. It's not the preacher's problem. It's not the elder's problem. It's not the college's problem. It's your problem because you are a part of the church. And you care about that problem. Nehemiah made their problem his problem because he cared. You know, I think about this. I sometimes wonder, so far as I know, there may be more than what's revealed. But from what I've read, I'm not sure that Nehemiah had ever even visited the city of Jerusalem before he went there to rebuild the walls. Why did he care so deeply for a city that he may have never even seen before? You know why? Because he loved God, and that was God's city. Because he loved God's word, and that was where those promises were going to be fulfilled. He cared. In the great story that the Lord told about, I better move all this stuff. I'm going to have something real messed up here in a minute. The Lord told that beautiful and wonderful story about the good Samaritan, the traveler who fell among thieves. The priest came by, saw the need, just kept walking. Levite came, saw the need, just kept walking. Why? I don't know why. I don't know why, what their excuse was, where it was they were going, why they felt like they couldn't help, why. They just didn't want to be burdened with this man's problems. Those were his problems. They weren't their problems. And if they stopped, it was going to take their time. They had time to be somewhere else. This was going to take time away. If they got involved, it might cost them something. There's no telling how much it will cost to give this man medical care. I need my money for this, or I need my money for that. I don't want to be burdened with that. It was just too much of a burden for them to care about that situation. But not for the good Samaritan. My guess would be he was just as busy as the other 2 men were, but he stopped. He devoted his time to the man, to give him medical attention for his wounds. Then he took him into the city and he put him in the inn. He stayed up all night with him, giving even more time, going the 2nd mile to help this man. And then before he left, leaving money with the innkeeper and saying, take care of him, and if you spend more, I'll pay you back when I come back through. See how he devoted himself to it? And the Lord said, this is the man we are to look at to understand what it means if you love your neighbor as yourself. This is what it means to care. You cannot say that you care unless you're willing to devote your time, your money, your energy, your talents, your abilities, whatever you have. Nehemiah cared. He cared about what was going on in Jerusalem. I'm not going to question whether or not you care about this church. I know you do. But what we're studying tonight is just simply to provoke us into remembering that when we care, when we really care, there has to be a willingness to work. Care is measured by the time and the attention that we devote to the things that we love. Think about those Laodiceans, Revelation 3, 14 through 17. They just sort of become comfortable. They were wealthy, had everything they needed, life was comfortable, no need to rock the boat. They just became okay with the status quo. The Lord said, I will vomit you out of my mouth. You're lukewarm. You're neither cold nor hot. You're just there. You're only taking up space. You don't have the courage to care. The Lord most certainly cared. And He does care. He cares more about this church than anything else. He shed His blood to purchase it, Acts 20 and verse 35. It means so much to Him. And the church needs people today who care about God. Matthew 6:33 says, Seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. All these things shall be added unto you. Who care about His church and its well-being, its classes, its services, its work, its gospel meetings, its lectureships, its vacation Bible schools, its people, its families, whatever it is that has to do with it. Members that care about the well-being of those things, who want to see them succeed and are willing to devote their time, their money, their energy to those things, who care about its people. Bear ye one another's burdens, the Bible says, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Galatians 6:2. What made Nehemiah a leader? He cared. He cared. So, when you care, what do you do? There's something you're supposed to do. What do you do? Well, first and foremost, Nehemiah prayed. Before Nehemiah tried to lead his people, he spent time before his God. We're talking about church growth in this lectureship, but what is church growth? Well, it's when your numbers go up. Well, yeah, but to me, that's a symptom. Numbers going up. You can have growth and not always see a drastic change in numbers. What is it exactly that we're trying to grow? I think primarily it's this. We are striving to grow closer to God. Those who are outside the church and are away from God, we're trying to teach them the gospel of salvation so that they can be forgiven, so that they can enter into a relationship with God. For those who are saved, we're striving to continue to teach them and encourage them so that little by little and year by year they can each grow stronger and closer to God. That's ultimately what it is we're trying to grow. Nehemiah understood that you can't lead others closer to God unless you are getting close to Him yourself. That's why he began with prayer. He began in that relationship with Him. The Lord did the very same thing. Every time I just want to get ready to complain about how little time I have to do the things that I need to do, I stop and I think about the Lord. No one ever had more demands on His time than Jesus did. And yet Mark 1:35 tells me that every morning He would rise up before daylight even, go off to be alone in prayer. Sometimes He would pray all night long, devoting Himself to prayer. Great leaders always make that a priority. Nehemiah most certainly did. Let me read a few verses here from chapter 1 and emphasize some of the aspects of Nehemiah's prayer life. Look at verses 5 and 6. And I said, I pray, Lord God of heaven, O great and awesome God, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments. Please let your ear be attentive and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now, day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. It stands out to me the reverence of that prayer. O Lord, great and awesome, the God of heaven. Nehemiah recognized that God stood out. God was different from all of the other gods, little g, that were being worshipped in Persia. These were fake gods. Jehovah was the one and only true and living God. There's much being said today about political correctness and how that should affect the way we pray and whether or not we pray. But I'll tell you this much. I refuse to pray in any way that would lead people to think that I believe that God is in any way equal with Allah or Buddha or any of these other so-called gods that are worshiped in this world. He is far beyond them. And when I pray, it is going to be to Jehovah God. And I will not pray in any way that would lead anyone to think that I believe that Jesus is in any way equal to Muhammad or any of the other religious leaders who have come along during the time, while this world has existed. He is not. My Bible says that He is the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. And when I end my prayer, it's going to be in Jesus' name, not because I'm being dogmatic about that's the way every prayer ought to be ended, but I want to make all people know that I understand He is the only way to the Father. There's no other way. It might not have been politically correct for Nehemiah to pray the way he prayed in the Persian Empire. Nehemiah didn't care. God was the one on the throne, and that's how Nehemiah prayed. He prayed continually. Verse 6 says he prayed day and night. When I read this, I can't help but ask myself, Brent, do the same words that describe Nehemiah's prayer life in this chapter, would they describe your prayer life this last week? Did you pray reverently? Are you praying continually? Or is it sporadically? Nehemiah prayed continually. That's one thing the government cannot limit. They might limit whether or not we pray it in public areas. They may limit whether or not our children pray at school. They can't legislate what happens in here. We must make sure that we do not willingly forfeit that right and blessing. Daniel was once arrested and thrown into a lion's den. Do you remember his crime? He prayed 3 times a day. I've often wondered how many days of my life I wouldn't have been arrested if I were in Daniel's shoes, just out of neglect. Daniel prayed. Nehemiah prayed continually. He prayed scripturally. In verses 8 through 10, Nehemiah makes reference to a number of different phrases from the law of Moses. His prayer is saturated with those concepts. God, remember the promises that you made to our people. God, remember the things that you said to Moses. God, you have promised to take care of us, and if we return to you, you would restore us. You said that you would. Nehemiah trusted in those things. He believed that God would keep those promises. God was not a gimmick that Nehemiah was using to try to get what he wanted. God was a father and a friend, and the communication was going both ways. Not only was Nehemiah speaking to God, he was listening to God, and his prayer is saturated with Scripture because of that. Some time ago, I started a habit. It's been helpful to me. I don't know, it may be to you. But when I come to the Psalms, there's various Psalms that I just read them out loud as though I'm the one that wrote them. And what I find is that book has taught me how to pray as much or more as any study I think I've ever done. Nehemiah prayed scripturally. He prayed confidently. He believed that the Lord would grant his request. He would grant him access to this king and help him to be able to convince the king to help God's people do what they needed to do. But his answer didn't come right away. In verse 1, it tells us that it was in the month Kislev when all of this began. You come to chapter 2, verse 1, it was in the month of Nisan when it all began to happen. That's a difference of about 4 months. Nehemiah waited for 4 months, but he never lost his confidence in what God would do and what God had promised. In Acts chapter 6 and verse 4, the apostles told the church, we will give ourselves continually to prayer and the ministry of the world. Now, listen, we're talking about a phase in the church when the church was literally growing by leaps and bounds. 3,000 on the day of Pentecost, 5,000 just a couple of chapters later. By the time you get to chapter 6, Luke has stopped counting. Now its multitudes are being added to the Lord. What was happening at that time? What was the climate? The apostles were the leaders. What were they doing that was so vital to what was happening in that time? We will devote ourselves to prayer and the ministry of the Word. Anything we say about church growth is just talk until we devote ourselves to those two things, prayer and ministry of the Word. All right, my time is gone, so let me quickly make this last point. Nehemiah volunteered. Nehemiah didn't pray, Lord, send someone who could come in and talk to this king and convince him to let us go back and rebuild the walls of the city. Nehemiah said what Isaiah had said earlier, here am I, send me. I'll be the one. I'm willing to go. Now, he was really taking a risk, not only his position as cupbearer, but maybe even his life, because according to the Persian law, you didn't take your problems to the king. He had enough problems to deal with. Nehemiah came before the king with a sad disposition, but evidently the trust that the king had for Nehemiah, he asked him, why this sad disposition? Nehemiah explained his situation of his people, and the king was willing to comply. Nehemiah was ready to be the man that would do the work, to go before the king, to organize the people, to build brick upon brick, brick upon brick until the walls were completed. In 52 days, that's exactly what happened. What had not been done in nearly 100 years was done in 52 days because they had a leader who cared, who had prayed to God for his blessing, and he was now ready to work with everything he had. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. There is no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you're going. Now is the time to work. So work with all your might. In the next chapter, it all begins to happen. Nehemiah is granted that opportunity, and he makes the most of it. But before we leave here tonight, the main question we must ask ourselves is, what will we do the opportunity in front of us? If you're an active part of this congregation or the congregation where you're a member, I just want to encourage you to take what we've said tonight and use it as fuel to keep going. If you can do more, do more. If you can do better, do better. But just keep going. If you haven't bought in, if you've been somewhat on the sidelines of late, and there are areas where you could be serving that you're not serving, I know it's going to take a sacrifice of time. It's going to cost you something. It's going to burden you. But you're going to be willing to bear that burden because you care. So buy in. Help in whatever way you can and give whatever you can to the work. But if tonight you're not yet a member of the Lord's church, the first step that you must take is that step that you take to obey the gospel. We urge you to come tonight believing that Jesus is the Son of God, repenting of your sin, confessing that faith so that you can be baptized in His name for the remission of your sins. He will add you to His church. And you can join in with this work as well. What better way to begin a lectureship on church growth than to see the number grow by one or two or three or however many it is that have an interest to come. If that's your desire, then please come now as we stand and as we sing.
I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning